Now, we have right now raging in Islam a party, minoritarian to be sure, somewhat unleashed by Saudi Arabia, which professes to say that every text is clear, just as it is, and no interpretation should be used. This is the no interpretationist party. In fact, if you'll bear with me, I'll show you a very interesting Quranic verse. This is the exegetical verse. It's Surah 3, verse 7 on page 127. He it is who has sent down to thee the book. In it are verses basic or fundamental. Well, Yusuf Ali has translated one Arabic word with two in English. I might say, in it are verses solidly established. And you even added a third thing of established meaning. They are the foundations of the book. Literally, they are the mother of the book in the Arabic. Others are not of well-established meaning. Well, that's a cop-out, where he says there's no negative there. There's another Arabic word which is usually interpreted as ambiguous. Others are ambiguous. But those in whose hearts is perversity follow the part thereof that is ambiguous, seeking discord and searching for its hidden meanings, but no one knows its true meanings except Allah. And those who are firmly grounded in knowledge say, we believe in the book, the whole of it is from our Lord, and none will grasp the message except men of understanding. Interestingly, if you change the punctuation, you can read this, for its hidden meanings, but no one knows, but no one knows its true meanings except Allah and those who are firmly grounded in knowledge, period. They say, we believe in the book, the whole of it is from our Lord, and none will grasp the message except men of understanding. Because the Arabic verb for say is only one word that incorporates the pronoun in it. So you could have that as well. In other words, that even creates in this interpretation verse an interpretational problem. Now, here we have solidly established verses and ambiguous verses. And people whose hearts is a deviation follow the part that is not solidly established or that is ambiguous, seeking to create discord thereby and seeking to interpret it or impose their own interpretation, in other words. So then it would seem rather important to identify the solidly established from the ambiguous verses, right? So the medieval ultra-literalist Ibn Hazm, the Spaniard who lived 900 years ago, said, the only verses in the Quran that are ambiguous are those like appearing on the facing page 126, Alif Lam Mim, the mysterious letters that appear at the beginning of some, and all of the other verses are solidly established, meaning that they have absolutely clear meanings and so on. Because Ibn Hazm had a theory of language whereby there is a one-to-one correspondence between words and meaning, and therefore there's never any problem of interpretation. You just read the text, oh, the text says that, oh, okay, that's it, let's go. That's how it is then, see. And of course, that's not the way language works, because that fails to account for a significant amount of phenomena in language, such as figurative language, for example. That's another translation of it, by the way. Some people would translate, some of the verses are well established and others are figurative or metaphorical, see. But I prefer ambiguous, I translate in this particular case. And the general ruling of the Muslim scholars on the verse is that the solidly established verses are those which enunciate some kind of law. And the ambiguous verses are the verses which deal with the nature of God and how God sits on his throne and what the judgment day is like and such things as that. In other words, they have various things open to various interpretations that we cannot prove, and therefore we shouldn't go pursuing to argue about that in great detail. So anyway, we have this literalist party. And that party grows out of the fear that if people are left to their own devices, they'll take the text and run off with it in all directions, and Islam will collapse. So that you need, for the sake of unity of the religion, you have to cultivate literalism. And there is some tendency toward that in the text and in the history of religion. If one were to write a book entitled The History of Literalism, that would be very interesting. If we go back to ancient history and we look at the earliest commentaries on the Bible, which are what? The earliest commentaries on a part of the Bible by anyone. Well, you might start, for starters, by think Jewish, because Judaism is before Christianity. Does that help? The commentary on the scroll of Habakkuk in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is a little thing, or the huge works of Philo of Alexandria, the great Middle Platonist Jewish philosopher. And nobody reading those commentaries could possibly imagine any of the explanations that those two early commentaries come up with. In other words, they seem to have very, very little relation to the text that they're supposedly based on, from which we deduce that ancient people tended to think metaphysically and not literally. And as we go through the history of the development of literalism, we can see indeed that a literalist party did arise in Islam and in Judaism at about the same time in the 8th century. And according to one Israeli scholar, thinks that they influenced even the Protestant Reformation. But whatever the case is, when the Protestant Reformation arose, clearly the literalist party is back in Christianity. And that went hand in hand with the text and with the development of science, because science is the most literalist of all types of ideologies and thinking. And so when you have this kind of literalism run wild, and that is a tendency in the modern age that we have to have that kind of literalism and bind the meaning of the text and so on to such and such and what people imagine it literally to be, then of course your question, which we started this discussion, you see that I'm not able to answer anything in few words, I apologize. The idea that the text is just something that you can interpret literally, that can't be right. It can't ultimately hold water. It remains something, a subject that is open. And the variety of interpretation certainly remains. What if you take, for example, verses like, kill them wherever you find them? Now, does that sound lovely and nice? And yet you think, well, the historical context of that was the wars between the early Muslims and the enemies. And, it was war, so, it was ideological conflict, furthermore, enthusiastic ideological conflict, from which you'd expect that type of consequence to ensue. And yet, you can find later on, some people will take that and interpret it as meaning, kill the sensuous and worldly desires in the self. There's a kind of introspective, sophistic type of interpretation. Now, that may not be deemed valid by the majority of the scholars of the religion, but the fact that it exists at all shows that that is there. So then the question becomes one of setting boundaries where, how far do you allow interpretation to go from some kind of central principle? And unfortunately, since it's not just an interpretation of one thing, but it's an interpretation of a million things, well, thousands of things anyway, some people will be liberal on one thing and conservative on another, and so you don't get an easy consensus there.